Aloha, Simon.
Aloha, Lisa. You're just
Yeah,
back from the islands?
yes, we had a week-long cruise around Oahu, Maui, the Big Island, and Kauai, and it
Awesome.
was lovely. I'm very relaxed, and
Awesome.
that's why, yeah, we maybe had a hiatus for a week.
Yeah.
How
No,
are
that's
you?
fantastic. I'm doing well too. I was just thinking about the fact that you and I are both uh, sort of fractional folks in the two companies that we're working for currently.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing fractional email marketing. I'm doing fractional strategic fundraising. And thinking about today's topic, it's like, how do you figure out where you need a half-time person or a quarter-time person? Or I'm getting an intern this summer to help with grant
Oh,
writing.
that's great.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, I think there's always this need in a smaller organization or even in a large organization, if you're a like you are in a business within a business kind of thing,
Right.
to look for help where you need it, to find, is it an agency, like a small one or two person agency like yours? Is it a big, New York, LA type of place, right? So,
Yeah,
and
well,
there's
why don't we
something in
talk
between.
Why don't we talk a little bit about our specific experience before we dive into kind of how you go about evaluating and then the roles that you can consider in bringing in a marketing person
Okay.
or how you engage with a partner. So, um, you've worked for large companies, small companies in the past, and now you're doing a little bit. Why don't you talk about what you've been doing a little bit
Uh, well,
in
a little
terms of?
bit. Yeah. I mean, I'm currently working for a nonprofit, and I'm helping fundraise essentially
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
with working with foundations. There are lots of family foundations out there, and lots of corporate grants and government grants and things like
Yep.
that. So,
Yep. And for that, I think a nonprofit is a great example because usually they don't have a huge budget. And
no,
so by hiring people part time that have really good experience is probably a good use of their funds
yeah,
as opposed to a full time person with a little less experience. So
I think
that's a thing to weigh.
it is, and I know that a number of the people in the marketing and development team that I'm part of started part time, and part of
Hmm.
that, like you
Yeah.
said, is just to get them in because
Yep.
that's all the budget allowed. But part
Right.
of it too was, is it a fit? Like when you have such a small team,
Exactly.
you have to have really solid like team spirit. Like if you
Hmm.
don't have that collaborative environment, if you don't feel safe, learning or
Yep.
sharing, and of course having lots of other experience that I'm not necessarily using right now, but I have some influence in the,
Hmm.
I no longer have to worry about managing website launches, but I certainly now am almost the
During the
client.
holidays.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, there's
Yeah.
lots of nonprofits have big pushes at the end of the year, but it's not quite the
Sure.
same as Black Friday. So,
Yeah. And then for me, I think my experience is a little bit all over the place. I actually started my career as a freelance graphic designer. So that's technically, you work for
yeah.
yourself. Over time, worked for large companies, small companies. And then I would say, really, in the last 10 years is when I took on this more of an agency partner role. And even that, I have very different engagements with people depending on what their needs are. So I've got one where I'm an advisor for sales calls. They pull me in for speaking marketers' language because that's who they're targeting, but they are
Right.
developers and they don't know how to speak marketing speak. I have a kind of general retainer with someone who I provide both tactical, like I roll up my sleeves, create emails, and then I will actually two clients that I have that where it's tactical, but then also strategic direction. And then I have another one that I'm literally just an advisor where they throw something in front of me and they say, hey, can you help with this? And they have all agency partners as well, small. It's a small company. There's 5 people, I think, there and then they hire vendors, and then they use me as kind of like a sounding board. And I also might evaluate contracts, because that's another thing. Like with advertising, it can get pretty complicated. And
Right.
so just making sure that they ask the right questions. So
Right.
there's like a bunch of different ways you can leverage
And,
somebody like you
and
or me.
and even though I'm working one job more officially, if you will,
Right,
I
officially.
work for you as well part time
Sure.
to help you with things tactically or strategy or whatever. So it's
All of the above.
definitely I think that especially when you're a small business, there's uh lots of flexibility, lots of different options. Any sort of marketing team can, be enhanced by bringing in the right people, right?
Yep, perfect word. So let's get into it and kind of where do you start? Where you're like, yeah, I should probably do, or I maybe I'm a small business owner and I've been doing a little bit of things here and there because it's my instinct. Like, oh, maybe
Right.
I'll Google gave me some money to try out Google Ads, so I'll try that, or I'll try Facebook, or I'll try, maybe I'll do email because I can kind of dip my toe. And we've talked about this, but then if you're actually saying, okay, I need to like hire a resource in some way, how would you recommend I would get started?
I mean, we start with your business goals and objectives, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then look at what the strategy is, what you believe your strategy is to address a certain segment with a product, right? You want to think about the solution that you're offering even more so maybe than the product, and defining those goals and objectives, I think, is where you start, because then you figure out if you have weak spots in your marketing.
Well, okay. Now that sounds good in practice, but I can imagine that some people might be even paralyzed by that concept. So maybe it's a to help them figure out what it is that what their goals are, is to maybe evaluate like where are the areas that I think I'm weak. Like, can they conduct an audit to say, or maybe it's like, I'm just trying to get more sales, so that's a goal, and maybe people aren't thinking about that. And it's I want to get more sales, and I just don't have the time to think about how to go about doing it. It could even be that broad.
I mean,
And
your
then
point about an audit is if you're getting some sales, and I think we've talked about this in the past, if you already have some existing customers and you know where they came from, that might be the place to start thinking about augmenting your marketing, right? How do you get more of the same customers that are already converting? Um, the other piece of it too is maybe you're really good at social. Like maybe you spend a lot of time on different social platforms, and now there's a way you just need to have a little bit of help turning that personal social experience into a business social experience, right? So
that's
that you
true.
have familiarity, but you're not exactly sure. So again, like you said, like assess.
Yeah, yeah. And it also might be like there's a number of not to jump ahead, but it's like you also can just do
Don't
if
jump
you
ahead.
need somebody,
Don't
well, if
jump.
you need somebody to even help you with honing in on what it is that you need. Now, I will little mini sidebar is for me personally, I tend to not, first of all, I don't do a lot of cold calls or outreach. People, it
Right.
tends to be word of mouth. And I also don't want to overstep my boundaries. So I usually spend a lot of time talking to somebody saying, tell me about your problems. Like, what are the things that you think are like, just talk. And they just tell
You as an
me,
agency, you as a
me as an
small
agency.
agency. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
do this as it's like a free consultation. So
Right.
I evaluate everything. And so I did a fairly comprehensive one with Christina after having a little bit of a hiatus. So because I already knew a bit about her business, but then I said, okay, things have changed it was like 2-3 years that we hadn't worked together. And so then I came back with like, here are the things that I am identifying. There's operational things that need to be fixed. There's maybe, you
Hmm.
know, other things that maybe we can consider doing. Like I had this whole big thing of like a big long evaluation, but then I presented it to her in like, what would you want to prioritize? Is there anything that you would want to change? And then from there, we honed in on something, and then it's just sort of evolved from that. So I would say early on, you can start to like use a partner to help you with that evaluation. And so for me, again, that's a free consultation because the idea is you're interested enough that you would actually, I can tell you everything. I've got tons of stuff on my blog, but the part is actually implementing it. And that's the thing that, I give it away, but if you can't do it yourself, I'm happy to help with that. So
And that was
didn't,
an ad.
wasn't meant to be. Again, I got enough on my plate right now. But yeah, it's but in general, like this concept of anyway, all right, like I'm getting ahead. So now let's move on though to the kind of like I think a typical thing though, I look at startups. So I know we talk about small businesses often, but I also think about a startup where they usually have strong kind of engineering, product development, that kind of thing. And the
Right.
marketing is a little bit of an afterthought, or the
Right.
CEO often has a MBA, and so has a little bit of marketing understanding. And they're smart people, and so they can kind of start doing things. What
Right.
they typically do is they hire a marketing generalist, and it's usually somebody with like maybe 3 to 5 years of experience. They give them a good title, a marketing director. It's an okay pay, but it's like supposed to be broad marketing. And then it tends to be like, okay, we need this right now. And so that person would focus on whatever that is. And then as the needs change, that person has to shift to other things. Unfortunately, sometimes though, this person might not have the experience to know what they don't know, or maybe they're very good at one particular area, but they're asked to do all these other things. So they have to kind of learn. So there's a little bit of a challenge there.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that if you know of or looking for a generalist, like you just described, I think one of the characteristics that you want is to hire someone who's curious. Because
Excellent.
if they're curious about, let's say they know social media or they know email, but they're not as, versed in say web or web commerce or even content creation, but they have a curious nature and they're interested to learn and they're sort of hungry. I know those are all sort of buzzwords, but when you find that person and they're willing to learn, right? And if you're as a business willing to give them time to do that, so as part of their, work week, they get to do a little bit of investigation and experimentation and things like that. There's so many, low cost, free tools. We've talked about things just to get your feet wet.
Yep.
Like you said, there's blogs, there's YouTube videos, there's so much stuff out there, even our stuff, that will like give you some like, oh, that's cool. Or, hey, I think I could tackle that. Let me give it a whirl. Right.
Yep.
And again, a generalist is great. Because they can cover a number of different areas, but, that there's always that saying, right? A jack of all trades, master of none. That's can be a good or bad thing, right? You can find some really great jack of all trades and they don't need to be like a knowledgeable like wizard in one area kind of thing, but sometimes you need that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there can be, over time, I would say that having that generalist, it becomes your business needs change. So you're constantly having to evaluate that. Is this the right role now? And it might not be, or maybe it is, or maybe that you don't want to like fire that person, but maybe that person is actually really strong in one particular area. So over time, if you're deciding to augment by keeping it in house, you might hire somebody a little bit more senior above them, and then they can direct them for the area that they're very good at email, for example. So that becomes their job. So their job has to evolve over time.
I think so too. The other thing typically you're going to get with a generalist is you're looking for someone who's very good at execution and tactics.
True.
And they're not necessarily a strategist, right? They're not going to navel gaze. They're not going to like create the vision for something. Although I've seen generalists really find their niche and say, wow, I really see how we could improve blah, blah, blah if we just changed the process here or the, whatever. So I think that, yeah, the generalists typically, I would say, I don't have data, but my sense is working with companies is generalists tend to be tactical, You may have to hire a strategist. That's where someone like me who comes in to do a newer job for myself, but I have a strategic background, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm able to help with that area as well. So that's also another sort of option. I think the other thing just to keep in mind is a generalist working so long as a generalist without, like you were saying, moving into a area of expertise
Mm-hmm.
is you really can run into issues of burnout,
Mm-hmm.
or the fact that because they came in and they only know a little bit about a lot of things, then they can't necessarily grow. Again, hire the right people if they're curious, if they're flexible, if tenacity and sort of, in a sense, maybe a little organized, they could go a long way in learning and growing in the role.
Yeah, and I will say that that is almost like my career is I've become a generalist because started as a graphic designer and then I was always curious, talked about that trait, and in my curiosity I was always wanting to learn about other things. So even as a graphic designer I started to find myself interested in, like, I was creating collateral at a and packaging at a software company, but I'm like, what happens to this collateral? Where does it go?
Right,
Who uses
right.
it, you know?
Well,
And
when
then
I met
yeah,
you, and that was nearly 20 years ago.
I
You
can't
were already
believe that.
moving into a role where you got to experience more elements of marketing. You were sort of the
100%.
project program manager.
Campaign management.
Yeah,
Yeah, which,
exactly.
well, that's another thing. So it's, as a sidebar, I also enjoy if a role doesn't exist and creating it. So even before I joined Adobe, we might as well just say it. I was at a I was at a company that it was a startup, and I remember I was talking to a hiring manager. And I was basically saying, "This is what I would like to do. I'm a graphic designer, but I want to manage a team. I want to be the one that's facilitating, like what the needs are of the business." And then the guy I was talking to, who was head of business development, we didn't have a marketing person at the time. He was like kind of like a creative services manager. And I was like, yes, like that's exactly what I wanted to do. I just didn't know the name of it. I
Right,
was just describing
exactly.
it. And so that
Exactly.
was what my job became. Then they hired Leah, who above me to be the head of marketing. And then they hired Betsy, who I think
Yep.
to be my boss. So I even had two layers above me, which at first I was like, but then I'm like, oh no, I have this very specific skill, And then Betsy was the head of marketing communications, and then Leah was head of all of marketing.
All
So
right.
it's, you
Rein
build
it
that.
in. Rein it in.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. It should be this.
Yeah. Pull it back.
Rein it
Rein
in,
it
rein it
in.
in. Okay, but anyway, what I was gonna say though is, like, so after that though, it's like every time I had another job, I would always find myself looking around. It's like once I would kind of get going on a particular thing, after like a year, I would all of a sudden say, like, okay, I need to do something else. And I would find myself into,
I
so
agree.
from campaign management to editorial management to web strategy, which I learned a lot from you, to test ticket optimization. Like, I was so able to get all of these other experiences because of my curiosity and because I built trust over time. And so I
Yep.
was able to do that, and I learned about everything. Okay.
I
End
think the
of
end of
tangent. It's not a sidebar. That was
not
a tangent.
it was a bit of a tangent. It was illumination of a particular topic. But the
That's a good marketing spin on
thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
I was going to say there's what you described to me is definitely this evolution of a
Yeah.
marketing generalist, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I had a similar
Well, I
experience.
was a
Hang on,
specialist that changed.
my
I
turn.
was, okay, your turn. Go.
I was just going to say that I remember being hired to do one particular thing for one product line. That was sort of my first web job, and that expand. And I was really a content person, updating pages,
Mm-hmm.
and then it expanded to actually managing the production team. So I had a writer and producer and a project manager and a developer and things like that. And then I went back to being focusing only on the web strategy piece of things. And
Mm-hmm.
then back, and I'll say that at Roku, right, I had all of it again. It sort of
Yep.
ebbed and flowed, and it was definitely this
Mm-hmm.
expansion contraction thing. So again, that's the other thing that, again, if you're interested in learning more, you can figure out like how to take that role and expand it and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But as a business, I think if we look at it from the business perspective, is, you're going to be able to ask this new generalist, could you investigate this? Like, would you figure out how that this might fit into our environment and things like that? So,
Yeah. Well, another thing too about, I would say this is going back to like a pro of hiring a generalist, is if you do find somebody that, kind of has that general experience and then hopefully are more cost effective than a specialist or somebody really experienced,
mhm.
you can augment their salary with tools. Because that's another thing that I think small businesses, startups, nonprofits are very sensitive about how much money they're spending.
Right.
And anytime there's some sort of subscription that costs money, it's like, but if you think about it, it's like if it costs you, I don't know, $500 a year, like if you added that to somebody's salary, you wouldn't think twice about it probably. So
Right.
if you think
Right.
of it in that way, like looking at the overall, how much can I budget for marketing as a whole? And then, over time you think of the advertising spend as being included in that. So just think of all of those
That's
components.
actually a really good point. And I think even more, I'll throw this in with
Thank you.
AI. Like
Yeah.
if you're willing to, AI, as we talked about a couple episodes ago, can really be your assistant, your personal
Mm-hmm.
assistant. And if you're a small business with a generalist, and AI, the $20 a month or whatever, might give them more latitude to investigate new things if the AI
100%.
tools are handling a lot of the mundane or repetitive type of tasks and things like that.
You know,
Um,
I
Go ahead.
can't reiterate this enough that I've talked to a couple of people recently that are like, I've not experiment with ChatGPT or anything at all. You have to. If you're
It's free.
in, you can start with the free version. Yeah, and just start using it. It's astounding to me. It's like, unless you want to be left in the dark ages, because you will be. It's like you're going to be left behind. Your job is going to be irrelevant. Like you need to embrace it and have it complement your job
So
today.
I'll. This is one of these things that I remember when I first started working for Apple, and I worked with a product called FileMaker, which is a
Oh
very
yeah.
simple database,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I wish it was still around because personally think databases work a lot better than spreadsheets, but that's a whole nother
Mhm.
conversation. But the idea with ChatGPT is, like, I think back in the Apple days, it was sort of like, well, what are you going to use uh,
Mm.
FileMaker for? What are you going to use HyperCard, which was another
Oh
crazy Apple
yeah.
product?
Yeah.
And people would, what was the first example? Recipes.
Oh, and I thought it was also
Digit.
your contacts.
Yeah. So it was like digitized recipes, or have all your recipes online, whatever that means, right? In
Yeah.
your computer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now it's 2025, and I used ChatGPT the other day to help me come up with a barbecue recipe, because I wasn't, instead of like, it's Google should worry, but it's to me replacing search, because I can say I have these ingredients and I'm making a barbecue for 5 hungry people, like and I'm
Versus not hungry people.
right, whatever. And it came up with some really good like ideas, and then I'm like, well, what if I don't like mustard? Remove the
Mm.
mustard. Like, what would you
Mm-hmm.
change, right?
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it was fascinating, and it's just like, it's like having a conversation. Now, I read some of it, and I'm like, no, that sounds like way too much of whatever.
Yeah.
But
Right.
and again, Chat GPT or any of these AI tools can make mistakes. So just
Yeah.
read
You
your
gotta check.
recipes
Yeah.
carefully. But I think, if you're afraid of these things, the only way to get over that fear is just to try it and
Jump in.
do something silly. Ask it for, I know people online who say, I want to help me create a weight loss menu for a month. Help me
Mm-hmm.
create a workout regime that I can
Regimen.
do at home. Thank you, regimen. And I only have 20 minutes a day, right?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of stuff that it gives you suggestions.
Okay.
All right.
Reining it back in. Yeah. Little
Wow.
sidebar there about
Way
AI
off.
again. I
Of
know. I
course.
know.
Right.
Well, okay. So then, all right, we talked about generalist, and then I want
Do
to
we
talk
need,
about the what?
Go ahead. Well, I was going to
What?
say, did we talk about some of the cons of a generalist? I don't
I
know
think
if we.
so. Burnout, we talked about. And then it just over time, we can just reiterate over time, your business needs will change. There's no doubt about it, unless you're literally doing the exact same thing. So as your business needs change, you really need to evaluate what that generalist can do, and you might just start to need to bring in somebody with a little bit more expertise. That's all.
Right.
They'll like I would say they'll sort of that need will change. So that's the only thing I'll say is
And,
kind of like and I
well,
don't even know
and
if it's a con. It's just like you just have to reevaluate.
yeah, and you're right. The generalist will sort of expose areas where you maybe need to make an investment in a specialist.
Yeah.
And you know, with one person, you can't scale, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's just, just like we said. So,
Yeah. Okay. So the trend now has been like you go from, okay, I got a generalist. And then if you go to the other end of a spectrum of a larger company, they have full blown marketing teams, they have agency partners, they have all these things. Well, the thing in between, I would say, and what the trend is you start to bring in what's called a fractional marketer, a fractional CMO, usually, so chief marketing officer. And what that is a very seasoned person, but it's not full time. Because usually, if you're a small business, you can't afford somebody that is an executive for a function that you don't need all of that. So as I mentioned
right,
earlier, the thing that I've done where I'm evaluating what does somebody need, it's that level of expertise that you can provide, and it might be a one-off thing because I've done both. Where I've done, okay, I evaluate what your needs are. This is a sort of interim solution. We're going to
mhm,
get you set up. We're going to get everything in place. We're going to provide the strategy. And then you've got your social media marketer that somebody's doing that part time along with their other job. And your front desk is doing email or, like you can
yeah,
do that where you've got a leader or somebody with the expertise to provide direction, and
right,
then the internal team can execute on that. So,
right.
you want to
I
add to
would
that?
just to say that I think if you're looking at something more like a fractional role that especially is more senior to manage, they have to be strategic, right? You have to find
100%.
right. They're going to have good tactical or execution because part of strategy is making your objectives right and reaching your goals. But I think you also really need someone who is going to come in and lay out either a process or a plan or a roadmap, all of those different elements of that are sort of ahead of initially your execution stuff. So just be sure that when you talk to people, interview someone for a part-time role, like a more senior role, a fractional role, especially in marketing, that they're strategic, that they sound strategic, that they have a strategic experience set.
And I think also, like you and I have different experience. And even though we both provide this kind of service, there are things where there might be things where I'm like, well, I could do it, but Simon's better at that. And
Right.
so, in the back of my mind, if I'm talking to a prospect, I have that. I know that. So, in a way, too, anybody that you evaluate, they also have a network likely of people that they can pull in for various things. So, I think your biggest strength for me is kind of web strategy, and then the inner workings of the back end technical side of website development. So those are the things where I'm like,
Uh,
I'm going to
yeah.
leave it to you.
And you know what? I know enough about the back end to call BS, right?
Right. Exactly.
But I am not a coder. I'm not a
No,
developer,
but you
and
shouldn't be.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't try to be one. I am like you said, technically dangerous. But also
Yeah.
that I'm also dangerous with Photoshop, but that's a whole nother story because one of our friends a few years ago saw me doing something and she's like, step away from the Photoshop. And she waved her finger at me. So,
Yeah, when I was a graphic designer, I remember everybody thought they were a designer because they could
because they
use,
could use a tool.
yeah, this desktop publishing was the rage. And I'm like, oh God, just because you can pick up a computer doesn't mean you know how to design.
And I think that the other thing, you want to be sensitive to the fact that you're probably working with people when you come in a more fractional role, that you may be working with generalists that are possibly using tools for the wrong things. I've seen people trying to design newsletters in Word or
Oh,
in
God.
Excel, or I can't even fathom it, or using PowerPoint to do a layout for a newsletter. And they
Well,
it's because that's what they have available, right?
yeah, and I would also say that there's people who are so like you and I, when we are brought in for an engagement as a possibility. So again, like they're being evaluated. And that's the other thing too. As a small business owner, you should evaluate multiple people because
Yeah.
there's a kind of connection, there's a relationship. Like you have to
Yeah.
build trust. And as I mentioned, like I'm lucky that a lot of the people that I've worked with, it's been people I've worked with in the past. So I already have that trust built up. There are new people though. And it's like Christina, I know we keep talking about her, and hi, Christina, she listens to us. That I didn't know her, and so it took, and she knew Angie and Jessica through like the neighborhood, and they were the ones that brought her to me, and so it takes time. I don't know that she would
Yeah.
admit this, but of course it takes time for you to earn trust. So you have to prove yourself, and so now I've known her for 5 years now. She knows
And she
my
still doesn't
experience.
trust you.
That's not true because she trusts you as an
I know.
extension as an
Uh,
extension of me.
yeah.
So that's important that you have a good connection with the person,
And a good
and then
and your good network, like you
network. I
said,
think that's
right?
good. But the other thing I was going to mention is that don't think that agencies are going to come in and just try to recommend the like solutions that they know. So I always try to be Switzerland. So if somebody comes to me and they're like, I use HubSpot, I use Wix, I use, whatever, I'm going to work with that. And then if it comes to a point where I'm like, this isn't working for us now. So again, that's happened before where I've seen costs go up significantly. And I've pointed out, you don't need to spend this much money if we move over here. And so it's not my decision, but I point it out. And I'm like, if you're willing to do that, it'll save you a few $1,000s every year. So I've been able to, and again, I don't have any alliance with any particular vendor. I try to be as sort of as, neutral as possible to provide value. That's the goal. So
Yeah.
circling back, I think one final thing is that as you go through this, you need to come up with your criteria of how you would decide, like what is your evaluation criteria in coming up with a partner. So I think there's the relationship part we talked about. There's the skills, obviously we talked about. There's the cost, that's a consideration.
Sure.
Are there any other things that you can think of when you're evaluating, whether it's the generalist that you start with and then over time maybe you pull in a fractional marketer? Um, what are some of the things that you think people should evaluate?
Again, I think I look to those very basic skills. Can you solve a problem, right? Do you have the curiosity? Do you, I'm a big proponent of hiring people who have aptitude, even if they don't
Yeah.
have experience,
Yeah.
because, you know,
I like that.
they may be, like I said, comfortable in one area of social media and you need something else, but you feel like they have the aptitude to do both,
Well,
right?
all right. Well, I'm going to give one last example.
Okay.
So I was at Adobe for 7 years and I held four different roles. That same thing, I built trust within that organization that I worked on something for a while and then I expressed interest in something else and I was able to move around and have a lot of different experiences. So it helped me round out my marketing. What
Hmm.
I didn't have direct experience with in was paid media, but that was what I set my sights on. Is like I want to be responsible for paid media. No experience. For 6 months, I was looking for a job in that, and I'm like, what am I doing? Nobody is going to hire me without this experience, right? But then I actually got an interview with Roku. I was very clear about everything. And my manager was like, yeah, but you got this testing experience. You clearly have done all these other things. Like, I get it. And you'll learn. And so I got hired. And it did take, the learning curve was a little tricky. So it was new company, new manager, new business, new everything. So
Right.
it was a little rough to start, but I did eventually find my way and then was there for a good 3 years. And I feel like one of the best experiences I had because I learned so much partnering with our agency partners that knew a lot and they taught me a lot. And I think it was really helpful. So,
Yeah,
anyway.
and I mean that's a great example of aptitude and the ability to learn and apply
Yep.
your knowledge. So things like that.
Okay.
Any other? Yeah.
Yes. Last thing I want to say is that people as are we are not doing a good job of reminding people to subscribe to this channel. Something like 75% of the people are watch, but they are not subscribers. So we ask that you subscribe. We ask that you tell other people. And then we also have our itsmostlymarketing.com website where you can
Ask the
ask us
host.
questions. You can do
Yeah.
that also within YouTube. There's comments in there that we answer, and then we are starting to do we have blog posts that we're adding to, so we just like tons of marketing questions. We're here for you. You can book a consultation with us as well. Anything else, Simon?
No, I mean, I think that is like we're always looking for a great topic. We want to know what you guys are interested in, what you. It may be something we don't have much experience, but we again through our network will find people
To talk about
or
it.
yeah to try to answer the questions and things like that. So
Go.
from tangents to tactics.
It's mostly marketing.